All right, well, welcome to the test review video for today. So as always, we're going to start with a passage overview and then move into an examination of every single question throughout the test. So every question will be listed here. You can go ahead and click on those questions to get an answer explanation. But I would always suggest if you're missing anything other than maybe a word in context or things like that, the passage overview is going to be really essential to understanding why a question was wrong. So let's move into our first passage here. So kind of unexpectedly, we have a paired literary narrative passage. So this does happen and this is produced by the ACT itself. So, or themselves. So we know that this is definitely a valid present thing. As always, with literary narrative, what we're looking to examine, the lens that we're looking to analyze these passages by is character and tone. So maybe if we're going to be employing any sort of annotation, anything to kind of keep track of the passages for ourselves, what we're going to want to keep track of is how do these characters relate to one another? Who is an important character? How does the tone contribute to how we may understand these characters? Plot is something that we need to know. However, different from maybe a book that we're going to be reading in English class in high school, plot is not the most essential part of this. It's character. So our first passage is Touring Home by Susan Power. And passage B is from Beyond the Narrow Gate, The Journey of Four Chinese Women from the Middle Kingdom to Middle America by Leslie Chang. So we know at least one of these is dealing with being from China or women who are Chinese, and the second one is about touring home. So let's read this first passage here. My mother tells me stories every day. So obviously, the very first thing that seems like it's going to be present or apparent is my mother, right? So I like to share her stories and chatter away when I'm able to command adult attention. So this sounds like the voice of a kid. Two important things there. She left the reservation when she was 16 years old. Okay. Didn't mean to kind of cross that out, meant to just underline it. This sounds like this might be an indigenous person, someone who's Native American who isn't to be in a reservation. That might be what I would assume. Left at 16. 16 sounds old to me. Okay, again, she's young, right? We kind of get that. Young. She'd never been on a train before, used telephone, left Standing Rock. Okay, we know for sure then that they are Native American. And they go to Chicago. Okay. Chicago is the destination. More character description here. This is really all about the mother. I usually laugh after saying this because I cannot imagine my mother being afraid of anything. All right, so this is somebody who really looks up to their mom and is proud. True Dakota woman. Okay, so she's of the Dakotas. Maybe that even means that is her, nation that she comes from. The Dakota people, one of the general Sioux tribes. She rises against the sun like a skyscraper. And when I draw, so skyscraper, she's tall and powerful. She attends sit-ins, talks politics, says what's on her mind. I am her small shadow and witness. I'm the timid daughter who can only rage on paper. Okay, so now she's described herself. Our narrator has characterized her mom and characterized herself through her mom. I grew up believing that Chicago belongs to me because it was given to me by my mother. Okay, so they travel around Chicago. They don't have a lot of money, but this narrator's mom really makes it seem as though Chicago is the ultimate, it belongs to the daughter. They go to the Art Institute and they see a Picasso. His blue period, the mother knows. So the mom knows a little bit about Picasso. I squint at the blue man holding a blue guitar. Was he very sad, I ask, immediately picking up on the blue period. I think he was, my mother says. I can see a story developing behind her eyes, and I tug on her arm to release the words. She'll tell me why Picasso was blue, but what his thoughts were as he painted his canvas. I will never find her anecdotes in books or footnoted in a biography. I don't even bother to check the references because I like my mother's version best. Phenomenal, beautiful. So at this point in our passage overview, we're going to transition to passage B. Some people like to go passage A, come back, read passage B, then do passage B questions, and then do them all together. I am more I'm more a fan of just doing them both at the same time because sometimes one of the passages will help inform what you need to know about the other passage. It doesn't seem like it's going to be the case on this one exactly, but sometimes in our humanities, or maybe sometimes we'll see something that is a little bit in science that's hard to understand. Sometimes one of the passages can inform our understanding of the other passage for things that are difficult. So anyways, transitioning to passage B, again, we're going to be looking for character. We're going to be looking for things that we can figure out with regard to character and tone. And we know that this is Leslie Chang, Journey of Four Chinese Women. There might be something to do with background, cultural background, as the first one seemed to include that a little bit in terms of being Native American. So water belongs to everyone and to no one. For this reason, I've always had a particular affinity for it. Okay, water is something here. So we need to know a bit about water. Westerners ask where my parents were born. But this response signifies nothing. The meaningful question would be where my ancestors lived. The answer to that is inland, not on the water. So we have Mongolia, the land of desert and grassy plains. And we have Wuhan. So her family does not come from the water, but nonetheless, she is called the water. And she knows that this bond is created by her mother. Okay, so both of these passages are doing some sort of deep consideration of mom. So she longs for a view more than anything else. We get this whole little period about being in San Francisco, looking for a place for a hotel where she could have a good view and see the gold sun and the blue sea. Okay, so we get that her mom also kind of can demonstrate this love for water. My mother may have descended from inland people, but they were also nomads. What is a nomad here? Her father once rode his horse practically the length of China. Okay, a distance of some 1,200 miles. So that is very much nomadic. My mother could only become a nomad herself, forever moving, changing, and going, yet always retaining some essential part of her being, in spite of all the places she has been. So her family were actual nomads. I mean, Inner Mongolia, there is a tradition of nomadism, in the steppe. However, her mom is a nomad in a different sort of sense, it seems. She is like water, not dead water, but fearsomely alive. When she gazes out on its expanse, she sees her own reflection. When I gaze out, I see her, my mother, always pulling away, returning and pulling away again. Okay, so her mom's like the tide. I drink from her and she slips between my fingertips. So it seems like she's someone that you can grasp only for a moment, but you can grasp. She has borne me all this way. I cannot decide whether I want her to stay or go. When she is here, I wish she would leave. When she's gone, I wish she would return. She pulls away again, a force as elemental as the ebbing tide. Okay, so she's really on this tide metaphor here. I remain a child on the store, eagerly collecting the sea glass and driftwood she has left behind. Okay, so a long extended metaphor there. I'm not going to really characterize how I think of that writing. But yeah, so long extended metaphor. Her mom is water, apparently kind of like the ocean, but apparently an ocean that you can drink because there's a tide. And she is left behind, always yearning for her to come back when she's gone, but always also yearning for her to leave when she's there. So that is our passage overview. I think we adequately looked at character. We have in both instances a narrator making sense of themselves through making sense of their mom. And the mother being kind of, in both passages, the most important character that is considered by our narrator. Okay, so question 1, this is a pretty simple detail question. In passage A, the narrator directly compares her mother to And then we have Picasso painting, shadow and witness, story behind someone's eyes, and skyscraper against the sun. So we have directly compares. So we can't allow any sort of implicit, suggestive thing. We can't basically allow our English class to come in here and, taint how we might view this. So a Picasso painting. So Picasso painting does indeed come up in passage 1A. And there is the off chance you could interpret that the fact that her mom is understanding of this painting to be some potential symbol for the mom or something like that. But it's definitely not established enough and absolutely not directly compared. So we can get rid of the Picasso painting. Shadow and witness. So we saw this in the passage as well. The daughter says, I am her shadow and witness. I am the timid daughter who can rage only on paper. So the narrator directly compares her mother. This is herself. So we can get rid of shadow and witness. The story behind someone's eyes. So we hear a couple of instances of like story behind an eye. So we have story developing behind her eyes for the mother up there. But she's not comparing her mom to that story. Her mom is doing that process. So it looks like skyscraper against the sun is the only thing that we can't get rid of. Let's see if we can find it, though, get to certainty and find exactly the reason for why our answer is correct and the reasons why all the others are incorrect. So looking at this, we can see that she is a true Dakota woman here in line 18, that she rises against the sun like a skyscraper. Her height is her power. So there we have it. D is perfect. Simple, detailed question that hopefully just by reading the passage, we'll kind of remember where these things are. We can kind of make note of where we will need to be returning. So that's question 1. Okay, so question 2 is a bit of an inference question. The narrator of passage A most strongly suggests that the reason she began to believe Chicago belongs to her is that she, okay. So this is about this sentence that we read in the passage. It says something along the lines of, it felt like Chicago belonged to me. So we need to, I would say that the first step we're going to want to take is just go and find this portion where our narrator says that they believe Chicago belongs to them. And then once we've identified that, we can kind of see why she's saying that. Let's see if any of our answer choices align with the sort of answer that we may come up with on our own. So even though it is most strongly suggests it's inference, we're going to infer by detail. So we still need to have something that is directly in the passage in order to feel comfortable with our inference. So let's go ahead and find this part where she's talking about how she feels like Chicago belongs to her. So where it arrives is right here. I will grow up believing that Chicago belongs to me because it was given to me by my mother. We didn't have much money, but mom takes me from one end of the city to the other on foot on buses. I believe it belongs to me because it was given to me by my mother. Okay, so the buses are invoked here. Her mom is a politician, does talk politics, but as far as I can tell, she believes Chicago will belong to her because her mother is giving it to her in the context of these travels. So let's see if anything kind of aligns with her mom gives it to her by traveling around. So F could take different routes. Okay, yeah, there's a little bit about travel without getting lost. She never suggests that she knows it really well now. And it doesn't include her mom, which is kind of integral, so we can get rid of F. G, had watched her mother directly influence the politics of the city. Okay, so we did see that her mom talks politics, but was that related to Chicago specifically? It doesn't seem like it was. It doesn't align with what we think, which is that her mom gave her the city through travel. H, she can move about the city almost unseen, like a small shadow. Very much not the case. The small shadow thing is completely different metaphor earlier, so it looks like J is going to be our only option. Initially explored the city with her mother as her affirming guide. So her connection to the city seems familial. Okay, yeah, that's her mom showing her the city, and that's how she gets it. Her connection to the city seems familial. That might be a tiny bit more of a inference than the rest of it, but this as a whole works much better than everything else. It kind of answers it along the lines of how we would have answered it to ourselves, which is always a good strategy for ones like these. So if you can find where she's talking about Chicago, you're in the right ballpark. You're on the path to getting this one right. So that would be what I'd suggest if you missed two. Okay, so 3, we have an inference question. It can most reasonably be inferred from passage A that the narrator doesn't bother to verify that her mother's ideas about Picasso and his work are accurate, primarily because the narrator. So, where do they talk about Picasso, and where does the narrator talk about the story she gets from Picasso? So, we're going to go there first and see, why does it seem like the narrator doesn't care whether her mom's ideas about Picasso are actually correct? So again, we see Picasso comes up right at the bottom here. So mom pauses before Picasso and says he did this during his blue period. And then the narrator asks, was he very sad? Yes, I think he was, the mother says. She feels a story exists in her mom, and then her mom tells or will tell a story. Tell why Picasso was blue, what his thoughts were as he painted his canvas. She relates anecdotes I will never find in books, never see footnoted in a biography of the master artist. I don't even bother to check these references because I like my mother's version best. So her mom is giving these sort of anecdotes, and the reason why the narrator doesn't quite care if these are actually accurate insights is because she likes them. She just likes them. She thinks they're good. She wants to believe them. So let's see if anything aligns with that. So A, doesn't know which references would be best for her to consult. Okay, she talks about footnotes. She talks about biographies. She knows where to look. So we're not going to think that A makes any sense. B is confident that her mother says about the artist is accurate and feels that checking references would be a waste of time. Okay, that seems maybe correct, but she's not saying because I trust her, it's because she likes the version best. So I'm a little iffy on B. Let's see if anything is better. C, doesn't care whether her mom is accurate given how much the narrator likes what her mom says about the artist. Okay, that sounds much better than B. So I'm leaning towards C right now because it's about liking. It's about enjoying. Likes what my mom says best. And then D wants to hold to her own ideas about the artist, regardless of what her mother says about him. No, she wants to hold to what her mom says. So I'm going to go with C here. There seems to be the specific reason for why C is right. And there, B, she just wants to believe it. She doesn't she's not out here saying, I think that my mom is absolutely correct. So I feel like if you got this one wrong, you probably chose B. Just make sure you give yourself enough time to verify that every single answer choice is or isn't correct, right? You probably just did not spend enough time with C if you chose B. So that's the last of the passage A specific questions. So now we have moved on to passage B. Question 4 asks, in passage B, the narrator most strongly suggests that she believes her answer to which of the following questions does not provide significant information about her background. So if you'll remember from when we went over the passage in the passage overview, the passage starts out with her saying that a specific question is not very relevant. So let's look at the beginning. So Westerners ask me where my parents were born, as though the answer will enable them to glean some knowledge. The answer is Beijing and Luoyang. The truth is that this response signifies nothing. The meaningful question would be to ask where my ancestors live. The answer to that is inland. Okay, so she's basically saying, don't ask me where my parents were born. Ask where my ancestors are from. So let's see if we have something about the birth. So how does your mother like your ancestors? So she says that you would find information from the ancestors, so not F. And G also would provide maybe some information. So that isn't it. Where were your parents born? Okay, that's exactly what they say. This is just a detail question. It's seemingly put like an inference question, but we got to infer by the detail. So we know it's H, but let's just say, why does water call you? No one's going to ask her that. So H is the only one that makes sense for 4. Pretty straightforward question. We just have to make sure we're reading the text carefully to get a question like 4 correct if we missed it. Okay, 5 has a great literary narrative question. So remember, literary narrative, we're going to be coming to it with a couple of different things in mind that are different from other passages. We're always going to be focused on character, and we're always going to be focused on tone. So 5 is asking about tone. basically diction is what creates tone, or one of the main things that can create tone. So as used in passage B, the word blinding, line 68, and the word overwhelm, line 69, both have a connotation that most strongly suggests a feeling of one of these things. So it's asking you, what is the tone here? We have to make sure that all of these are obviously very different. Fright, awe, regret, and quietness. We need to have the whole context of basically this whole paragraph in order to answer this. So let's go ahead and look. So here we have it. It offered a view in each direction that was brilliant and blinding. If there had been a chair, she would have sat forever, letting the gold sun and blue sea overwhelm her through the glass. Okay, so we're going to need a little bit more here. So this is about the narrator's mom. She longs for a view more than anything else. Once, staying at a hotel in San Francisco, she insisted on seeing 3 different rooms before she found one which made her with which she was satisfied. It was on a floor so high it made me dizzy, with a corner window overlooking the bay. Even so, my mother spent most of her time on the bridge linking the elevator bank to our window. The bridge consisted almost entirely of windows. It offered a view in either direction that was brilliant and blinding. If there had been a chair, she would have sat forever, letting the gold sun and blue sea overwhelm her through the glass. So she's absorbing it. She's sitting there just being awash in this view that she never wants to leave. So fright, definitely not the case. Awe. What does awe mean? It's awesome, right? It's something which inspires a deep kind of, it's almost like a perplexing impressiveness. She's just got to keep looking at it. Awe sounds pretty good right now. Let's see if regret, if there's anything else in the passage that suggests she's regretful, maybe this could be there, but there isn't. Quietness, blinding, and overwhelmed don't have any connotation to quietness. So we're going to be choosing awe. Makes a lot of sense. Overwhelm and awe, those go together pretty well. Okay, a word in context that again is sort of a little bit tone-like, but more just word in context. Like, what does this mean? In line 79, the word dead is most nearly used to describe a water that is one of these couple of things. So let's just go ahead and look at it. We actually already have it underlined. In this, she, the narrator's mother, is like water, not dead water, but fearsomely alive. Where does this, so let's see where this continues to go. My mother is always pulling away, returning and pulling away again, always in movement. She pulls away again, a force as elemental as the ebbing tide, again, movement. So she is not dead water, but rather fearsomely alive, always moving. So it seems like non-movement is what dead refers to here. It's like flat. So colorless, color isn't a thing that's talked about at all in this extended metaphor of water. So colorless can be gone. Obsolete. Obsolete means that it's essentially doesn't work. It doesn't function anymore. It's irrelevant. That also does not work. So we can get rid of obsolete. Stagnant. When it comes to water, stagnant water, simply put, means still. It isn't moving. A lot of times there's sometimes a connotation of it's dirty, but stagnant water is just water that is not moving, simply put. And she's saying, my mom is moving water. My mom is more like a tide. So stagnant as the opposite of her mom makes a lot of sense. So stagnant looks good. Frozen. Now we can be frozen still sometimes, right? So you might want to lean towards frozen because of that. But in the context of water, what does frozen mean? It means ice. And she could have said ice rather than water in this case, right? So her mom is not stagnant water. Rather, her mom is moving water like a tide. That makes sense within the tone and character focus that we take towards this literary passage. And it just works in the context of this. So that's why we can go ahead and choose H. 7 is a longer, tougher question because it requires us to understand a little bit more about literary techniques than simply rote ideas. We need to identify what the context is for this last sentence. So let's read it. I remain a child on the beach, or I remain a child on the shore, eagerly collecting the sea glass and driftwood she has left behind. Okay. So we need to know the rest of this extended metaphor. So if you didn't get this extended metaphor, I'd suggest you watch the passage overview and get to this part of the passage overview. But essentially, this paragraph, especially after this dash, is that her mom is like the tide. She's like water and like the tide. For some reason, a tide that is drinkable, which is funny for this extended metaphor, but whatever. Okay. So when she's here, I wish she would leave. When she is gone, I wish she would return. But she pulls away again, a force as elemental as the ebbing tide, the tide that goes out. I remain a child on the shore, eagerly collecting the sea glass and driftwood she has left behind. So her mom is the tide, and the tide is what leaves behind the sea glass and driftwood. Her mom isn't out here with a bag of sea glass and driftwood and she dropped it on the shore to go, get a breakfast burrito or something like that. Like, the mom is the tide itself, is an ocean, and she, the daughter, the narrator, just stands subject to the force of the tide. So this is another metaphor, a metaphor that it continues our extended metaphor. So let's just go through these. A metaphor for the narrator's feelings as her mother goes away from her. Okay, that sounds great, right? There's nothing that sounds wrong with that. Let's just see, though. Let's get to our kind of certainty, right? Confidence is when we can say, okay, I have a specific reason why an answer choice is correct. But we got to make sure that everything else is wrong, too. A memory of her childhood and of her mother that the narrator holds dear. No. We know that this isn't a memory. Her mother is just being epitomized here as a tide. A literal explanation of the way the narrator reacts to her mother's actions. Because there's this she is left behind part here, that's why we know that this isn't literal. It's not like when her mom leaves, the narrator goes to the beach to collect some sea glass and driftwood, and she does it eagerly, right? This is a metaphor. Reference to a set of objects that the narrator as a child often found on the shore. Okay, so it seems like, yeah, there could be, maybe this could be something that has happened before, but it is best described as a metaphor because that's what it's functioning as. If the narrator had perchance found these things on the shore, would that make it super relevant? Not necessarily, right? What's relevant is that how it relates to the extended metaphor of her mother being like the tide. Okay, so the following questions are all about both passages. So if something exists in only one passage, we can get rid of it for any of these. So 8. Which of the following actions do narrators of both passages closely connect with their mothers? So let's just get rid of a few that are only about one. So Chicago, that's passage A. Passage B is SF, so we can get rid of Chicago. Staying at hotels and cities, that's all passage B, so we can get rid of J. So F and H, speaking openly and boldly. Seems like maybe passage A suggests that a bit, but passage B doesn't really consider what their mom is saying too much. And then traveling and moving. So moving and being a nomad is absolutely a part of passage B, right? She's moving like a tide. She's a nomad. She's moving from place to place. Passage A, the mother moves from her Standing Rock reservation to Chicago and then moves all around the city on buses and on foot with the daughter, and it gives her daughter a feeling of that she owns Chicago, or Chicago's a part of her. So if you aren't getting this right off the bat, you need to watch the passage overview. This question is made tricky by the passage, not by the question itself. So F is really sensible here, and if you got this one wrong, you got to watch the passage overview, which came at the beginning of this test recording. All right, so question 9. The narrator of passage B would be more likely than the narrator of passage A to describe her relationship with her mother as being marked by one of these things. So passage B would more likely see her relationship with her mother than passage A to be a certain way. So again, this really needs a passage overview. So if you miss this question, I would suggest you first watch the passage overview that comes at the beginning of this passage. Ultimately, if we're being asked how a narrator would describe something or a passage would describe something, they already did. Okay? So how does passage B describe their mom? As a nomad, as someone who is always coming and going like the tide, as someone who, when she's away, you want her, and when she's close, you want her to leave. seems kind of interesting, right? Like she's always out of touch, but when she's in touch, it causes problems. Passage A describes her mother, the relationship with her mom, more as one in which her mom is guiding her, guiding through her to an understanding of Chicago, guiding her to an understanding of Picasso's paintings, all of the sort. So let's see. A, moments of lively conversation and pure joy. No, right? Passage B doesn't have a conversation at all. The only conversation that's basically a little bit invoked is Westerners asking, where were your parents born? B, years of fierce competition and debate. You could have maybe assumed anything like this, but that's way too far to make that assumption if you chose B. If they're asking what the passage B would likely say, we need to see what they said. They never brought up fierce competition and debate, so we can't choose it. Displays of physical affection and warmth. They don't touch each other ever in passage B, so we can't choose C. Lastly, D, feelings of distance and tension. Let's just make sure that works. Yeah, distance. When the tide goes out, that's distant. When the tide comes in, she wants her mom to leave. Tension. Perfect. Easy for that, okay? If you miss a question like this, you're having a hard time solving the big problem of reading, which is the passage itself. Watch that passage overview to get a sense of it. Okay, 10, the classic synthesizing. What do both passages do? So in both passage A and passage B, the narrator of the passage shares information about her mother's something. So I'd suggest you watch the passage overview if you haven't, if you missed this question. But let's just think about these things. So relationship to the narrator's father. Does passage A bring up the relationship to the narrator's father? No. H, academic interests. Do academic interests really come up in either? Not really. It seems like the mom knows a little bit about art. Doesn't necessarily seem academic, but passage B doesn't discuss academics at all, so we can get rid of H. Physical appearance. Okay, passage A, definitely big on the physical appearance. She's tall, like a skyscraper. But does passage B bring it up anywhere? Doesn't seem so. It really is more about the mom's inner life and where she comes from. It's the fact that she loves the ocean, she's obsessed with views, and her family is from Mongolia. Her dad, you know, her dad rode his horse the distance of China, and that her mom is distant, always going and coming like the tide. So physical appearance, it's not there. So personal history, yeah. Passage A, the personal history is that her mom left the reservation at Standing Rock when she was 16 years old, moved to Chicago, figured things out. Passage B, the mom, it comes from a family that is, you know, from Inner Mongolia, and that she was born in presumably Beijing or somewhere else, one of the two cities that she mentioned. And we get this sort of information, and the fact that her obsession with the ocean seems to be interesting or unexpected on account of the fact that she's from the inland. So they both have personal history. That is that for passage. Okay, so our second passage, which we'll overview, is a social science passage. Akin to most social science passages or science passages in general, we're looking to identify the structure of this passage. So what builds and what does it build to? Sometimes social science on the ACT is just a little bit more of an overview, which is more the case with this one. So we are going to be looking for specific things, but, you know, just erring on the side of what actually is going on. So we start off comprehensive report on the ice industry. We had 8 million tons harvested. So we know we're talking about the ice industry. Though the business was so extensive and production so poorly documented that it was at best a well-informed guess. Henry Hall put it together. Of the 8 million tons of storage, about 5 million reached the consumer. So that means that there was a lot of waste involved. Biggest market was in New York, and none of its ice was manufactured artificially. It was all cut in winter and stored in hundreds of ice timber warehouses. Between New York and Albany, 150 miles up the Hudson River, there were 150 ice houses, but that was not enough to even supply the metropolis. So talking just about New York there, there was an ice famine, prices went up. In order to meet this ice famine, they go all the way to Maine. Though the demand for ice rose annually, they did not explore the use of refrigeration. Instead, they bought up sections of the Kennebec River, and inland, similar things went on. Ice companies buying up shoreline to supply meat industry and brewers with ice. The first real crisis was not by competition. So the real crisis in the trade, so this is something that affects the industry. This is an industrial go over, was from pollution. So this is classic 1800s, late 1800s. As cities grew, they encroached on rivers and lakes from which ice was cut, and soon there was a health scares. They searched for cleaner supplies away from town and stimulated a search for manufacturing ice. The realization that bacteria could cause diseases such as typhoid added urgency to finding safer forms of refrigeration. So we've kind of seen it at its heyday, 1879. And we know that its heyday was, it grew a lot from the previous decade to the current one. The natural ice trade began to decline in the early decades of the 20th century, as although in some areas ice was, electric power was not available, ice was abundant in winter, it survived as late as the 50s. As ice harvesting died out, the evidence disappeared. These big things were just, these big ice houses were no longer relevant. If you go to the bottom of lakes and rivers to this day, you'll see odd instruments. These are all of them, where we can see all these different instruments from a bygone era. These are also gone. All that is left in America of this once great industry is the water itself. So this was a great industry in America, but it is no longer there. So what is the real structure of this passage? It's pretty simple. They talk about the heyday of the ice industry of the United States from around 1860s to the late 1870s, and that a lot of this ice was serving metropolitan areas and industries such as New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Milwaukee. And New York went up to Maine even to get this ice. However, some of the dangers of ice, including bacteria, pushed us towards artificial refrigeration. And by the 1950s, by the early 20th century, most places didn't have ice in this form, and the ice industry was mostly dead. And then by the 1950s, electric power supplanted it everywhere across the United States. All that's left are the relics. So a pretty simple structure to this passage. I'm assuming that a lot of the questions are going to be detail-oriented as a result. So let's go ahead and move into the questions. So this first question, question 11, which of the following events referred to in the passage occurred last chronologically? Pretty straightforward question here. So we start off in the early 1860s or 1870s, and we end with, all that remains are the relics. So the first comprehensive report, that is not last chronologically, that might be about first. B, divers emerged from lakes and rivers clutching ice industry implements. Okay, so that's all that remains are the relics. That seems like it's probably going to be right. C, all these cargoes were sold. That's 1800 still, as is D, the 1800s. So these are all from the ice industry itself, but B actually takes place in our modern era, much after the ice industry is no longer relevant. So that is why B is our answer to 11. Very straightforward detail question. So 12 is a straightforward detail question. The passage states that in terms of the natural ice industry, the decade from 1869 to 1879 was characterized by one of these things. So there's a little bit of a trick to this. They never say the decade from 1869 to 1879 specifically in the passage. But remember, when was the first comprehensive report on the industry? 1879. So we can assume there might be some sort of information about this somewhere up there. So let's look up into 1879. So in 1879, there were 8 million tons harvested annually and 5 million tons reached consumers. The figures were put together by one Henry Howe, who signed himself special agent and gave an account of the great growth of the industry in the preceding 10 years. So preceding 10 years means the previous 10 years. We don't want to confuse that with proceeding 10 years. So there was great growth in the decade before 1879. So that means we can assume it's 1869 to 1879. So let's see. F, significant growth. Okay, that's correct. Let's just make sure that nothing else is more correct. Okay, so damaging publicity, no. High shipping prices and mildly declining demand. All of these things are potentially evident in eras after 1879. We start to see that thing about typhoid. We start to see that it's expensive to get it from Maine. We start to see that eventually people prefer to use artificial refrigeration. All of that is after 1879. So the preceding decade, that's when there is significant growth. Okay, so 13 is a pretty important question. It's a detailed question. It is a word and context question. We probably know a little bit about what metropolis might mean. We know it means city, most likely. Regardless, we don't want to be goaded into thinking that this means any city. So we're going to return to these lines. We're going to let the questions guide how we return to the passage and see what's up. So as used in lines 19 to 20, the phrase metropolis refers to. Okay, so let's look at it. So between New York and Albany, 150 miles up the Hudson River, there were 135 ice houses. But even this was not enough to supply the metropolis, which relied heavily on imports. Okay, so we need to see a little bit more. By far, the biggest market was in New York, we see on line 14. And none of its ice was manufactured artificially. It was all cut in winter and stored in timber warehouses that lined the lakes and rivers and had a capacity up to 50,000 tons each. So all this ice is going to New York. So the metropolis is going to be referring solely to the metropolis of New York City. So Philadelphia comes up later, but that's just an example of something else. Albany is a part of upstate New York. It's included in this, but this isn't the metropolis here. This is kind of like the final spot where we see these ice houses. And the average US city in the 1870s, you know, what says this about cities and or else throughout the rest of the country? So detailed question, we've got B, New York City. Remember that this is not asking us what does the word metropolis mean in general, which maybe would be a bustling city. Rather, it's asking which metropolis is being referred to in lines 19 to 20. So 14, based on the passage, the 1879 Maine ice that was 15 to 20 inches thick can best be described as something. Okay, so we're just need to return to that. This is a detailed question. So where do we see this ice? There was a bit of a famine in the New York and Philadelphia areas when there was warm weather that destroyed the harvest on the Hudson River and local lakes. That year, the ice was 15 to 20 inches thick in Maine, a top quality crop, and it could be shipped down at an estimated cost of $150 a ton, pretty easily shipped. So it sounds like that's probably going to be correct. It's probably going to be that it was a good quality crop that was shipped relatively cheaply. So F, a top quality crop. Okay, they said that word for word, and it was shipped to New York, Philadelphia, and destinations further south. Okay, nothing seems wrong about that. G, sufficient for local demand, but not a solution, excuse me, to the problem of ice famine in the South. We don't hear about the ice famine in the South. We hear about the ice famine in New York and Philadelphia, and it is helpful for their demand. H, typical of Maine crops of ice until the ice famine struck, not sensible. They are in a famine year and they have this really good ice. And J, remarkable, but surpassed in size and quality by crops the following year. They don't really talk about the following year at all. So we are going to have to go with F for 14. Detail question. Okay, so 15, we have a main idea question, which always wants to make sure that we're considering the context of the whole passage, as well as the specific paragraph it's asking us to look at. This will likely be pretty straightforward as the passage itself is mostly an overview. So the main idea of the fourth paragraph, lines 55 through 67, is one of these things. So let's just read that paragraph again and see if we can kind of get a main idea from it. So the natural ice trade began to decline from the early decades of the 20th century. Though in more remote areas of North America where electric power was not available, but like lake ice was abundant in winter, it survived as late as the 1950s. Okay, so it started to decline. As ice harvesting died out, the evidence of its vast scale rapidly disappeared. There was no alternative use for the great ice houses, many of which simply burned down, often set alight by a spark from a steam train. They were surprisingly flammable, as most were made of wood and kept as dry as possible to better preserve the blocks of ice they housed. But the majority were just demolished or simply rotted away. So the decline started at the beginning of the 20th century, and very quickly, most remnants of the trade disappeared. So let's see if anything aligns with that. A, the natural ice industry declined over several decades, leaving few traces of its magnitude. Okay, that sounds pretty much perfect. That's almost exactly what we said. Let's see if anything else is something that would maybe be better. The arrival of the steam train signaled the demise. No, the steam train just burned down a few things. Ice houses were extremely flammable and therefore few remain. Okay, so while that is brought up in the fourth paragraph, is that the main idea? No, that serves the main idea. That serves the main idea that not much is left of this large ice industry. D, in the 1950s, the natural ice industry experienced a short-lived revival. No, that's about the time it finally had its final death knell. So A is going to be the only answer choice that seems sensible for this main idea question. So 16, we're having to consider rhetoric a bit. So the author most clearly indicates that the contents of the manufacturer's catalogs referenced in the fifth paragraph typify the natural ice industry's something. So let's see what the contents of the catalog is. So one or two museums keep small displays of these tools, the tools used for the ice industry, we know. And collectors have preserved manufacturers' catalogs that proudly present their versions of the ice plow, ice saw, grapple, jack grapple, breaking off bar, the caulk bar, the packing chisel, the house bar, the fork bar, the float hook, the line maker, and many other specialist implements, the use of which has long been forgotten. Okay, so they spend a lot of time listing all, but not even all, but just an exhaustive list of all the different products that can be used for the ice industry. So why do you think we did that? Probably to exhaustively show how much went into the ice industry. So F, rapidly respond to the market changes. It looks like these manufacturers' catalogs are brought up just to show something about the current day, right? About the fact that this thing was really expensive and might not be around anymore. So definitely not F. G, ability to erect ice houses. So this is not just the ice house work. This is work in collecting ice in general. So that's too specific. Wide array of tools. That looks good. J, simple work. There's so much stuff there. Obviously, it is not simple. So H is the only one that works here. Pretty straightforward. 17 is a pretty interesting question. So it's asking us to look at all these lines of evidence and see if the author, quote unquote, contradicts himself elsewhere in the passage. So what is a contradiction? First, we'll need to obviously establish a contradiction is where someone states something contrary or opposite to what they said previously. So if I were to say, that the ACT is ultimately really difficult, and then I said, everybody gets a perfect score, that's contradictory. So let's look at what's contradictory maybe here. So basically, we need to see something that the author says the essential opposite of or gives proof against later. The place that we oftentimes see contradictions is in extremes. You've probably learned a little bit about extreme distractors at this point in your program. Extreme distractors are ones which say all, every, no. Those ones are the ones we're probably going to want to look at. So A, of the 8 million tons of ice harvested, about 5 million reached consumer. there's nothing that contradicts that in the passage. Okay, that's just a fact. A lot of times contradiction is going to be an opinion as well. B, New York suppliers did not explore the use of artificial refrigeration. So what did they do instead? Instead, they buy up sections of the Kennebec River shoreline. Okay, so it shows that they did something else, at least in the time, the time that this is considering. I mean, eventually, maybe they started using refrigeration in the 1900s, but at this point in time, they did not explore. See, there was no alternative use for the great ice houses. So do they say that there was any, let's see if they bring up any other use for ice houses anywhere else, because that's pretty extreme. Do they talk at all whatsoever about ice houses being used as anything else? So they're just flammable, demolished, rotted away. Seems to suggest no. There was no particular use for ice houses. So then all that is left in America of this once great industry, the ice industry, is the water itself. That is contradicted. Why? Tools of the former ice trade have fallen to dry ice and are found by divers across the northern states. So no, not all that remains is the water. There also are the tools that are inside that very water. So he's contradicting himself with that and trying to make his poetic claim. So that's why D is incorrect. Or D is correct. What he said was incorrect. And clarifies question 17. Okay, 18, a very simple detailed question. According to the passage, in the time period referred to in the first paragraph, how much of New York City's ice was made artificially? Okay, so the time period in the first paragraph is the heyday of the ice industry. Highest market was in New York, and none of its ice was manufactured artificially. So we just need to find the answer which says none. J. This is really simple. You missed a question like this, you're not minding the P. You're not really engaging with the problem of the passage. You have to read deeply and find that. This is a pretty straightforward question. It's directly in the text. Very, very ACT style question. Okay, so this is also within the same time period for 19. The passage states that for shipping purposes, natural ice was sometimes stored in or packed in any of these things. So refrigerated boxcars, waterproof tarps, sawdust and hay, paper and cloth. Let's see where they talk about shipping natural ice and see if they refer to anything in particular. So that year, the ice was 50 to 20 inches thick in Maine, a top quality crop, and it could be shipped down to New York at an estimated cost of $150 a ton. This produced a frenzy of harvesting on the Kennebec, Penobscot, and Sheepscot rivers, and 2,000 cargoes of ice packed in hay and sawdust was shipped south to New York, Philadelphia, and other more southern cities, where they were sold for a total of around 1.5 million. Okay. Sawdust and hay, it says it directly. Remember, this is the ACT. Some of these questions are just getting at you for speed. This is directly in the passage. What we just have to do is feel like we understand the structure of the passage when we're attacking the problem of the passage, so that questions like this, we don't get stuck looking for where, oh, where do they discuss shipping natural ice? We know right away it comes after that ice famine, when they're shipping ice from Maine down to the south, down to New York, down to Philadelphia, like we saw in question 14. That is how we can get 19. Okay, so for the final question on this passage, 20. The passage indicates that the first real crisis in the natural ice industry can be attributed to one of these things. So when did this crisis happen? Remember, we have to understand the structure of the passage. We have to know after they talk about the heyday of ice, they pivot to discuss the first challenge. So it's this paragraph right here. So the first real crisis in the natural ice trade we see was caused not by competition from an artificial manufacturer, but by pollution. So pollution was the first real crisis in the ice trade. So, as it happens, J directly corresponds with that. The Great Depression is never brought up anywhere. Weather and pattern changes maybe, cause a couple of problems with famines, but it wasn't a crisis. They say the first crisis is polluted water. We got to seek that first real crisis, word for word in the passage. H, the advent of refrigeration, that really ended that natural ice industry, but it wasn't the first crisis by any means. So with that, we've worked through our second passage. Okay, so this next passage here is our humanities passage. Remember, humanities for the ACT, a lot of times we're going to be looking a lot at expert testimony. So sometimes we're just going to get a description of one particular artist or one particular art style. Sometimes it'll be something related to an art form, but typically we're going to find humanities relating to the humanities, which is art. So in this case, we're particularly talking about the differences between subtitles and dubs. So here we have a blurb, and the blurb is actually really, really essential. Dubbing refers to providing a film with a new soundtrack, especially dialogue in a different language. So anybody who's engaged with any sort of anime has probably seen the differences between subtitles and dubs. Anybody who's interested in foreign film or foreign movies or TV has probably encountered this difference of dubbing versus subtitling. And that's what this article goes about in total. So remember, we're going to want to try to keep track of our different expert testimonials and see how those things build over the course of the passage, see if we can determine a main idea, and see additionally if those expert testimonies are contradicting that main idea of the author or supporting that main idea of the author. So start out with just a little bit of an overview of, we introduce kind of the question. Filmmakers have debated the respective merits of subtitles and dubbing since the earliest sound films. All the way back in 1940, Michelangelo Antonioni wrote that someone who was doing a dub was unbearable to Antonioni because they became half Clark, half Costa. Costa being, I'm assuming, the dubber, and Clark Gable being the actor. It was unbearable. Dubbing was an acoustic surrogate of acting, and it compromised the intention of the director. Pasolini said between the two, dubbing was less harmful because it allowed you to see the full picture. Renoir called dubbing a monstrosity, a challenge to human and divine laws. Okay, so we have a lot of expert testimonial here. Renoir, director. Pasolini, director. Michelangelo Antonioni, another director. All of whom are big-time directors, by the way. If you ever get on the Criterion Collection, you'll see these names. So you can tell that all of them seem to, at least in this stage, be opposed to either subtitling or dubbing and see them at best as necessary evils and at worst monstrosities that challenge human and divine laws, which is quite excessive. I wouldn't say praise. So now we get into the second paragraph. We have another expert testimonial. Federico Fellini, who is another big director. 8½ is a movie he made, which I think is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. He didn't agree with any of them. Dubbing was an extension of his shoots, a technique which he would use to retouch and rewrite. He mercilessly dubbed over his actors, changing dialogue in post-production, sometimes having worked without a script. He reportedly instructed his actors to count aloud in front of the camera so that he could insert new dialogue afterward. Renato Cortese told a story of an old Neapolitan lady who tells a story on the camera. This woman talks a tale about her grandson. Fellini instead has a track about war and hunger recounted by an actor from a different part of Italy. So there's the expressiveness in the face of the South, but the accent of the North. Okay, so we kind of have two big structures here. Up here we have filmmakers slash experts against dubbing slash subtitles. And then here we have Fellini a proponent of dubbing. So this is a very obvious structure here. So we need to kind of see how maybe our author feels about this now. So looking at a dubbing studio, you see actors move in particular ways while they're performing these lines. So there's an over-the-top zest, there's a melodramatic speech to their movements. They coil and twitch in front of the microphone. Why, they ask. It is because they're trying to recreate the bodily sensations that are on the screen. So dubbers are really trying here. So it seems like our passage is transitioning from a understanding of dubbing and subtitling, particularly dubbing, from just the perspective of filmmakers like it does initially, to now a different kind of expert, an expert in doing the dub. Few options. So in Italy, there are still few options for those seeking to watch subtitled movies. There was initially one on Via del Corso, which closed after a long battle involving show business, American expats, etc. Italians remain hooked on dubbing, perhaps because of simple affection. Familiar voices yield emotional attachment. So far what we've seen is that in Italy, dubbing is really popular. Federico Fellini was an early proponent of dubbing, whereas a lot of other earlier directors were against it, and that dubbing requires a lot of work to make it work. This paragraph now introduces a critique of dubbing from a different expert perspective. So there is Verino, a dubbing director who is known for adapting foreign films considered to be undubbable, such as this, Welcome to the Sticks, which relies on linguistic misunderstandings for much of its comedy. So puns. Are puns going to work in English the way that they would work in Spanish or Italian or any other language? Probably not, right? So trying to convey that through a pun, through a dub is going to be very difficult. Apparently, there's also a habit that Italian dubbers have, which is to use the same foreign actor for all films. An example of this is Luca Ward, who essentially becomes half Ward, half Jackson, in line with what Antonioni said. Even Meg Ryan's dubber is always dubbing for Meg Ryan. So it seems like in Italy and perhaps in other places, but we're just talking about Italy here, the voice actors essentially become the voice of a particular actor, American or English-speaking actor. Meg Ryan's voice will always sound the same in Italy if so long as Meg Ryan's dubber is always working with movies that Meg Ryan's in, which seems to be the preferred case. It is rare to do like Variano and break the habit of matching those same dubbers to the foreign actors for all films. So that's our passage overview. Pretty straightforward in that we see dubbing is something that initially directors were very resentful of, but became very popular in Italy. And there are sometimes when the efficacy of dub, or the efficacy of dubbing is difficult. It doesn't exactly translate or demonstrate what's going on in the language of the initial film or the initial language of the film. but nonetheless, it is something that has endeared itself to Italian audiences. So we'll move into the questions after this passage overview. Okay, so for our first question for this passage, question 21, we're asked a main idea question through the lens of a final sentence. So the last sentence of the passage primarily serves to illustrate the passage author's central claim. So we first need to kind of understand what that central claim might be. So if you miss this question, I would recommend you look at the passage overview video, which comes directly before this question. That will clarify, I think, a lot of what may have led you to get this answer choice wrong. Ultimately, we do know that the central claim has something to do with the fact that dubbers and dubbing is a sort of peculiar process, and dubbing is one of those things where we create a half Clark, half Costa. We create a half Ward, half Jackson. There's this kind of uncanny valley almost, if you've ever heard that term, that we get from dubbing. So our first, a dubber wants others in the film industry to respect the actor he or she usually dubs. That doesn't come up in this last sentence, which we should read, right? Ward told me he was off to have dinner with actress Meg Ryan before raising an eyebrow and clarifying, with Meg Ryan's dubber. I'm having dinner with Meg Ryan's voice. So A, that is not a central claim of the authors. B, the work of Ryan's dubber is as effective as that of Jackson. So Meg Ryan and Samuel Jackson's, that's again, not the author's central claim. C, a dubber begins to seem almost like a hybrid of him or herself and the actor that he or she dubs. Okay, that half Ward, half Jackson, half Clark, half Costa. Meg Ryan or Meg Ryan's voice, or Meg Ryan's dubber. This seems pretty good, so I'm not going to eliminate C. D, Ward is unlike most dubbers in that he prefers to dub many different actors. Okay, not true. Ultimately, all of these other answer choices are trying to answer a main idea question with things that are very, very detail type question or type answer choices. So the only one that seems to actually convey a central idea, that seems to convey a claim that is sustained from the beginning to the end of this passage is C, which is why we can answer this main idea question with C. So that's 21. So 22 is an inference question. It can be reasonably inferred from the passage that regarding whether dubbing is useful or valuable, Vairano would most strongly sympathize with the views of one of these other directors. So let's find where Vairano's claims or opinions are presented. That comes up here. He is a dubbing director known for adapting undubbable films. He is one of the few actors to break the habit of matching the same ones, and admits that he is hated by the most prima donna dubbers for this. So he is he selects dubbers that fulfill the requirements of the role. He's looking for dubs to supplement a movie, and he's a dubbing director. So he is somebody who believes in the idea of dubbing. So if you watch the passage overview, which comes a little bit before this, you'll see that we talk about all of these different expert testimonials, and primarily directors are the expert testimonials in this humanities passage. Let's see, we probably want to find a director who agrees or sympathizes with the idea of dubbing, who finds it to be not just a necessary evil, but maybe something that is important in its own accord. So Antonioni says dubbing is just a mere acoustic surrogate of acting. Fellini loves dubbing. This whole paragraph is that he's a big proponent of dubbing, as we see in our mental roadmap annotation. So Fellini seems interesting to me. Pasolini says that dubbing is less harmful, but that they're both evil, dubbing and subtitles. Finally, Renoir famously says that dubbing is a monstrosity, a challenge to human and divine laws. So obviously not him. Obviously not Antonioni. Fellini is the only one, which makes sense for G, because he appreciates dubbing, and Vairano, of course, is a dubbing director who seems to be keen on utilizing it for the benefit of a film. So 22G. Okay, so question 23 is one of those rhetoric or main idea kind of questions where we're asked about the function of a piece of writing from the perspective of the author. So we want to determine what was the author's intention, what is the author hoping to do, how does it function? So the main function of the second paragraph is for the author to present something. So let's remember what happens in the second paragraph. So the second paragraph is when Fellini is shown to be a proponent of dubbing compared to these other filmmakers and experts who have maybe a distaste at best for dubbing and subtitles. So we're looking for something which clarifies a contrast. So if you got this one wrong, I would suggest you watch the passage overview and then return to this question. So which of these demonstrates a contrast? So the author would be maybe her own ideas as an example of a contemporary perspective on the merits of dubbing. She doesn't really give her own ideas too much. She really allows her subjects, interviewers, experts to say everything. So we can get rid of A. B, a perspective on dubbing that bluntly counters those outlined in the first paragraph. Okay, that sounds really pretty close, right? Fellini just bluntly, prefers and utilizes dubbing. Meanwhile, all these other people say that dubbing is an abomination. Seems like that's a pretty contradictory thing. So B is appealing to me initially. C, Fellini's personal direct response to Renoir's criticism of his work. Okay, that Renoir does not directly criticize Fellini as far as we can see in this passage. Fellini does not directly respond to this non-existent criticism. So we can get rid of C. It's very specific and doesn't exist. D, a claim centered on Fellini's work that strengthens the argument she makes in the first paragraph. So what is the argument that she makes in the first paragraph? Ultimately, she's just presenting that there are negative opinions towards dubbing and subtitles, and then provides a very positive one. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it supports the argument or strengthens the argument made in the first paragraph. Rather, it counters the opinions that are shared by the experts in the first paragraph. So that suggests we have B. Okay, so 24 is another main idea rhetoric question, which really requires we understand the passage overall in order to answer a question and to get the correct answer to this question. So that means if you got this question incorrect, you probably will want to have watched the full passage overview recording a little earlier. However, let's get into this. So the anecdote about Fellini's footage of a woman recounting a tragic tale, lines 25 to 33, primarily serves something. So let's just read that before we get too far into this. So Renato Cortesi, a veteran Fellini dubber, told me that during the filming of Amarcord in 1973, he witnessed Fellini ask an old Neapolitan lady to tell him a sad story. Over footage of this woman recounting a tragic tale about her grandson, Fellini added a new soundtrack about war and hunger, recorded by an actor from Emilia Romagna, I don't really know Italian, combining the vivid expressiveness of the South in his favorite Northern accent. So it seems to me that Fellini already knows he's going to dub by asking her to tell a sad story. So let's see here. If anything aligns with that, and also considering that this article in general seems to consider that dubbing is an essential part of the filmmaking process and watching films, especially in Italy. So F, explain why Fellini preferred to feature voices with Northern accents in his films. Okay, there's no explaining there, right? It's just stating, so we can get rid of F. G, provide a famous example of Fellini closely following scripted dialogue. Okay, so we already saw earlier in this paragraph that he did not usually follow a script. So we can get rid of G. H, illustrate the extent to which dubbing was a part of Fellini's craft. This seems pretty in line with what we already were saying, seemed plausible for this. So let's just keep that in our pocket. J, show why Fellini preferred his actors to follow a script rather than tell their own stories. That's directly contradicted in the quote. So again, ACT, pretty straightforward here. H is what works for 24. Okay, so 25 is a secret detail question. As Cortese is presented in the passage, does he agree with the passage author's assumptions about the reason for Dubber's over-the-top zest? So first things first, line 34 is where this quote is used. So let's just read this paragraph basically. If you visit a dubbing studio, or if you visit a dubbing studio, the over-the-top zest of the actors is evident in everything from their melodramatic speech to their movements. Sitting in front of the microphone, they coil and twitch. I asked Cortese, here he is, Cortese, whether this was a consequence of having to focus on one's lifelong talent into the few centimeters between mouth and microphone, a kind of bodily rebellion to the condition of being heard but not seen. He laughed and said, this is hardly the reason why we twitch and turn. We're reciting while trying to recreate the bodily sensations of what they see on the screen. If there's running in the film, they will run on their feet. The moving is the result of recreating large movements in small spaces. So here we are seeing that ultimately he says, no, this is hardly the reason. The reason why the author gives is maybe this is a rebellion to the condition of being seen but not heard, or vice versa, it's being heard but not seen. Cortese says that's definitely not the case. It's just trying to convey the space and the movement. So we can get rid of A and B because no, he does not agree. So yes does not work. So C, gruffly makes clear his belief that she does not understand anything. Did it seem gruff? He kind of seemed gracious with it at the beginning. D, no, and he corrects her misinterpretation with an explanation of his own. That is exactly what happened. So again, on the ACT, our answer choices are oftentimes the ones that are correct, are very straightforwardly correct. And D is what is exactly what happens here. So that's what we get for 25. So 26 is an inference question, but as is always the case on the ACT, or usually, our inferences are things that we can infer by detail. So it's actually a little bit more like a detail question. We're not going to be doing any of the inferring that we would do in a typical English class. It can most reasonably be inferred from the passage that the Metropolitan Cinema on Via del Corso was known for showing films that had been either dubbed only, subtitled only, both, or neither. So let's go ahead and see where this takes place and see what they say. So there are few options for those seeking to watch subtitled original language films at a movie house in Italy. Okay, so it seems like it is rare to find something that is subtitled in original language. So that means it's not dubbed and it is subtitled. So subtitled only. Let's see if this cinema on Via del Corso is an example of that. The Metropolitan Cinema on Via del Corso closed recently after a long battle. Italians remain hooked on dubbing, perhaps because of simple affection. Okay, so it seems like the Metropolitan on Via del Corso is exemplifies this right here. So that means ultimately very straightforward detail, G for 26. So 27 is very similar to 26. If you missed 27, maybe watch a little bit of 26 because that's where we're going to be looking. So the passage most strongly suggests that at movie houses in Italy today, compared to subtitled original language films, dub films are something. So we're trying to compare dubbed films to original language films in terms of which are easier or more prevalent within movie houses. So this paragraph right here. There are few options for those seeking to watch subtitled original language films in Italy. The Metropolitan closed. ultimately, Italians remain hooked on dubbing, perhaps because of simple affection. Familiar voices yield emotional attachment. So it seems like they are hooked on dubbing, and there are few places which have subtitle-only films. So it seems like dubbed films are much more easily found than subtitled original language films. About as easily would suggest that they happen at the same rate, but if they're hooked on dubbing, it is the preference. So which one is closest to preference? A. Okay, so the wording of question 28 indicates that it is a simple detail type question. So the passage indicates that a foreign film with which of the following characteristics is particularly difficult to dub? So what could make dubbing difficult? So where do they talk about difficult dubs? Is in this paragraph up here. So Murano is known for adapting foreign films considered to be undubbable, which rely on linguistic misunderstandings for much of its comedy. So an undubbable film is exemplified by Welcome to the Sticks. And the reason why it is deemed undubbable is because it relies on linguistic misunderstandings, maybe things like puns, things like that. So let's see what we have. So there it is, linguistic misunderstandings that create comedy. Classic ACT question. It's a detailed question. It's word for word. All these other ones, maybe you would think that that would be hard to dub, right? If you missed 28, you most likely just were choosing what you thought might be the most difficult thing for dubbers to do. But it very clearly says the passage indicates something. So whenever we have that, make sure that we're pulling direct evidence from the passage. Our opinion on any of these is ultimately unimportant, right? What matters is, can we find things in our big problem, which is the passage, and use that to solve our little problems, which are the questions. So just make sure you're sticking with the passage itself, not bringing in your own opinion too deeply. And you'll see very clearly that linguistic misunderstandings is what creates difficult dubs. So for 29, we have another simple detail question. According to the passage, whenever we see that, we know we're just looking for almost word for word details in the passage. So according to the passage, the work of dubbing director Vairano differs from that of most other Italian directors in that Vairano, what does Vairano do differently is what we need to determine. So it's going to be in this paragraph right here. Vairano explained that actors become just as attached to their parts as audiences do. Vairano has been one of the few directors to break the habit of matching the same Italian dubber to a foreign actor for all his films, preferring rather to select the dubber according to the requirements of the role. So he's breaking a tradition, he's breaking a habit. That is different, right? So breaking a habit shows difference. That's showing that he's differing. So which of these aligns with that? B. Does not necessarily match the same Italian dubber to the same foreign actor for all his films, as is typical. He gets some chagrin for this from other prima donna dubbers in Italy, but that ultimately, if you missed a question like this, it's probably that you are assuming what you think would make his work different, right? It mentions that he works on a kind of obscure French film. Maybe that would suggest to you like, oh, that's unique of him. We're only looking for what the passage directly says is unique or different or anything of that sort. So that's what we have B for 29. So our final question for this passage, 30, is a phrase and context, vocab and context question, lines 16 to 17. So remember, we're going to be looking at does it fit and does it match a definition? So As used in lines 16 to 17, the phrase a challenge to most nearly means one of these things. So let's just read the context of where this is. So director Jean Renoir called dubbing a monstrosity, a challenge to human and divine laws. So monstrosity is what really helps us understand a challenge, in that a challenge is an elaboration, a clarification of what the monstrosity is. So these are very intimately related. So something that leans towards monstrosity, badness is going to be there. So we're not going to be needing to think about, oh, a challenge is this, like, something we would see in the show Survivor, right? What we need to determine is which does it align with this kind of monstrosity invocation. So an assault on, that would mean an assault on human and divine laws. Now, that seems pretty close, right? It's saying that this is like an abomination. It should never existed. Dubbing should never exist, and it's breaking the law. It's violating law. F seems very close. G, a declaration of our laws. That doesn't make sense. That'd be a law code. A question for our laws. A monstrosity that should be questioned by our laws. That doesn't really make sense either, nor does J. So F is very clearly the answer 230 as a result. Okay, so our final passage here for ACT 198 is our natural science passage. I believe that the best way to orient ourselves in a natural science passage is to use the mental roadmap annotation essentially to determine what every portion of the essay is doing, what their focus is, in order to build up a structure, an evidence structure for our eyes when we're going to the questions, and allow that structure to pull us closer to making sense of the main idea. So let's just get into working through this passage. So our first paragraph here is a pretty straightforward introduction to the topic. So during the Industrial Revolution, the high price of steel made that many projects were used with cast iron, which is brittle and prone to failure. When Bessemer's new process was greeted with Bessemer created a new process that was greeted with jubilation, and he was lauded not just as an engineer, but as a scientist. Okay, so maybe we can write something along the lines of Bessemer's new steel method equals groundbreaking. So being able to see something like that when we move with questions is going to be helpful. So our next paragraph talks a little bit about the way in which Bessemer and others figured out the science of materials. So Bessemer is controlling carbon in order to make steel. This was first, this kind of, the importance of carbon has been noted for a long time. So starting in 1774, Torbern Bergman, a scientist, started to figure this out. And then he was a mentor of another person who was a major scientist who discovered oxygen. Okay, so we're initially already seeing that there is a sort of intention of this passage to clarify that materials engineers, or materials, people who are focused on materials such as metals, are scientists just as well. So maybe some background to steel and carbon. So in working with this, they're clarifying that it's a science. That's what the passage is doing here. So oxygen is a key component of the air, which was key to the Bessemer process. So now all of a sudden we are getting the Bessemer process described to us. So a blast of air is pushed through the molten metal. So oxygen removes impurities from the pig iron and adjusts the carbon content. You push out silicon and remove carbon in the form of volatile carbon dioxide with the blast of air. Pig iron contains as much as 4% carbon. Steel has only about 0.3%. Okay, so here we now have Bessemer method equals use oxygen to push out impurities. We have another paragraph about the composition of steel. It was long known that steel can be improved with a spice of other elements. So then we get to some of them. What specific of these introductions, of these specific details, is going to be relevant to our questions, we'll figure out later, right? We're going to let the questions guide how much we focus on the difference between manganese, nickel, chromium, etc. But we just want to say other elements can be used to improve steel. Examples. So examples are in the paragraph, okay? So notice we're really creating a very effective building up of the structure here. So now here comes the big question. But is this science? So ultimately, that's the big evaluation of this passage. But is this science? Some of the early innovations in steel alloys were chance discoveries, often due to impurities incorporated by accident. In this respect, metallurgy has long retained the air of an artisan craft, akin to trial by error. But the reason for this empiricism is not that the science of metallurgy is trivial. It is because it is so difficult. According to, here we have some expert testimony. I think artisan craft will be important. According to Rodney Cotterill, the science of materials is that of the brain. Oh, well, never mind. Yeah, so he's a scientist of the materials in the brain. Metallurgy is one of our most ancient arts, but is often referred to as one of the youngest scientists. So for this paragraph, okay, so very, very interesting perspective there. Our final couple of paragraphs are examining the same thing. One of the principal difficulties in understanding materials depends on the structure over a wide range of length scales. So from packing of individual atoms to the size and shape of grains, even millimeters in size. Science has trouble dealing with a span of scales. One might regard this difficulty as akin to that in the social science, where social behavior is governed by how individuals behave, but also how we interact on the scale of families, neighborhoods, cities, and a national level. So there's a problem of scale in both of these. So I'm just going to put a notability doesn't allow me to type over here. So scale, we know that this scale problem is present in material sciences. as well as social science. Social science is kind of used as an analogy in order to better understand how scale can be a problem in materials. The mechanical properties of metals depend on how flaws in crystal structure move and interact. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit more about flaws. The most common type of stacking fault, which is this flaw defect, is a dislocation. So metals bend rather than shattering because dislocations can shift around and accommodate deformation. But if dislocations accumulate and get entangled, restricting their ability to move, the metal becomes brittle. So dislocations accumulate, metal becomes brittle. This is what happens after repeated deformation, causing the cracking known as metal fatigue. Metal fatigue sounds like a technical term that we'll want to know. So basically, all of these technical terms, these things that we've never encountered before we came into this passage, or most likely never encountered before we came to this passage, are going to be essential elements, or probably potentially essential elements. These are going to be things that will maybe pop up in a detailed question. So keeping track of our technical terms and jargon, such as dislocations, is going to be very helpful. So these dislocations can get trapped and divide a metal into a mosaic. The arrest of dislocations at grain edges means that metals may be made harder by reducing the size of the grains. So this passage overall, as we can see, is, so I'm just going to say PS for problem solving over there. I will know what that means. And will you if you write it yourself. So we progress from an initial kind of consideration of the science of making stuff from the beginning. We see Bessemer and his new steel method, why that is so important and so effective. And then eventually we kind of transition to considering just general difficulties with the science/art of material science and the fact that it is a little bit different from other sciences, it's suggesting, maybe more akin to social science. So that is our passage overview. So question 1 here, the main purpose of this passage, is a main idea question, very straightforward. And when I say question 1, I mean this passage, so question 31, of course. So let's just kind of examine the structure that we built in our mental roadmap to help us understand the main purpose of the passage. If you missed a question like 31, I would recommend you watch the passage overview, which was recorded a little bit earlier, to examine this. So we see that we're talking about the Bessemer steel method, the background of steel and materials, how the Bessemer method worked, how other elements can be used to improve steel, and then a question of what is materials? Or is it a science or is it an artisan craft? Is it an art? Then we talk a little bit about how materials is difficult because of the scale, and then how materials can be difficult because of different defects that build, so problem solving. That's what this PS stands for. So ultimately, it looks like steel is a lens by which this passage makes sense of material science in general. So it seems to be very practically focused. Steel is really the main thing that's considered. Let's see how, if any of our answer choices align, generally speaking, with this perspective. So A, explain in detail the various experiments Bessemer conducted in order to develop a better steel. Okay, so this is a distracting answer choice. It's wrong. Why is it wrong? So yes, it discusses how Bessemer developed a better steel, but it does not explain in detail the various experiments he did. All it really describes is just the one thing that worked for him. We don't find out the process by which he determined that, so we can get rid of A. Additionally, Bessemer's creating a new steel or a better steel is definitely not the focus overall, the main purpose of the passage. Rather, it seems that the main purpose of the passage is to use Bessemer's Better Steel as a lens to look at steel and the science of steel and metal in general. So B, provide an overview of some of the scientific principles that apply to the creation and behavior of steel. That looks pretty good. So, I wonder if steel could be potentially a little bit too focused, because when we get to here, we're talking really all about metal in general. But I mean, scientific principles is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the scientific principles of adding other elements is, going to create a stronger, improved steel. Removing impurities creates stronger steel. Carbon was first identified by people earlier on with steel, the importance it has to steel. So much of it is focused on steel. I think B looks pretty close. I'm probably leaning towards B right now. Let's see if anything else is better. C, describe some of the philosophical questions concerning metallurgy. Okay, this is a really good distractor, but I'm confident that it's wrong. Philosophical questions concerning metallurgy. There is one semi-philosophical question, and additionally, it is definitely not the main purpose of the passage. So we have this question of, is it a science or is it an art? That ultimately, for one, that's the only question that's asked, right? So we're not getting some of the philosophical questions. We're asked one question, which is sort of philosophical. That is not the main purpose of this passage. You can tell I feel like a lot of people may be choosing C, but once you've created this mental roadmap, you can see how everything is really oriented around kind of a practical discussion and overview of how steelmaking is done and how that relates to other metallurgy, metal science. So B is still better than C here. And then D, illustrate the differences between pig iron and cast iron. Okay, definitely not. We get a little bit of a discussion of that at the beginning, but that isn't sufficient enough to be the main purpose of this passage. So B is our answer here. Again, if you missed this question, this is a big deal main idea question. You got to watch the passage overview and watch how we kind of attack the big problem of reading, which is the passage itself, and then move into the kind of sub problems or the questions and the question portion itself. So B is how we will answer 31, and the way we get there is looking at the structure on our passage overall. Okay, so 32 is a rhetoric question here. The author most likely includes details about the initial response to Bessemer's new steelmaking process in order to do something. Okay, so why do we hear right here the response to Bessemer's new steelmaking process? So we already identified it in our passage overview, which I would suggest you watch if you haven't. That Bessemer's new steel method is groundbreaking, or is denoted to be groundbreaking in this first paragraph. So let's see if anything aligns with this sort of groundbreaking. So F, emphasize that Bessemer's new process was a significant achievement for the industry. So achievement, groundbreaking, those things are related. So I'm looking at F right now. I'm feeling like F might be a good one, but remember, I want to make sure that nothing else is offering something that is superior, right? G, provide support for the author's opinion that Bessemer's new process was prone to failure. Okay, definitely not. That's almost an opposite distractor. Bessemer's process reduced failure because it reduced a lot of impurities. H, describe Bessemer's qualifications as an engineer. So does showing the response provide qualifications? Not necessarily, right? Maybe if they talk about his educational career, his mentors in science, things like that, we would maybe have something more concrete, but we can get rid of H. J, provide specific examples of the criticism that Bessemer's new process received. So I don't really see any criticism taking place up here. And ultimately, F is the only one which works. So again, the process of elimination on ACT style questions is always going to lead us pretty quickly to a good answer. a lot of times what makes an answer choice wrong is really evident. So always operate from that lens. Okay, so for 33, we have a classic inference question. Remember on the ACT, if we're asked to infer, we can always infer by detail. So it can reasonably be inferred that the author includes the information that Bergman was a mentor and sponsor of Shields, mainly to do one thing. So we have to remember, where did this take place first off? So notice that up here, we were talking about the background. This is when we get Bergman and Scheele. So Bergman and Scheele are both underlined. So we see that Bergman was by any standards a scientist, teaching chemistry, physics, and mathematics. He made an extensive study of all these different things. And as a mentor and sponsor of Scheele, almost maybe second-handedly or something, discovered or helped instigate the discovery of oxygen. So his protege discovered oxygen, and he was a teacher of chemistry, physics, and mathematics all. So it seems like it's trying to establish that he's really well-rounded, he's important, he's influential, and he ultimately is, a scientist in doing all these things. So what can we infer then? So what is the point, right? So this also includes a bit of a rhetoric idea. So why would the author do this? So introduce the fact that Bergman was a teacher as well as a scientist. Okay, so that's something that does happen. I don't know if that would be really the best rhetoric response. I'm not really sure that's why the author does it, but it isn't necessarily wrong. So let's just keep A around. B suggests Bergman was a more successful scientist. Okay, not the case. Being a teacher doesn't make you more successful. And Scheele discovered oxygen, which is pretty significant. C, give an example of the 18th century notion of scientific communities. So I'd say actually probably the opposite. He is involved in physics. He's involved in chemistry. He's involved in math. He's involved in materials. D, reinforce Bergman's credibility as a scientist. Okay, so between A and D, both of these sound pretty good because we are establishing Bergman's credibility as a scientist all throughout this paragraph. It's almost the purpose of the full paragraph. A occurs, but so does D. So now it's a question, which one seems to be more related to the purpose or the reason for why this specific idea of Bergman being a mentor? I would say introduce doesn't really work with A because we hear that he's a teacher earlier. I would say D feels a little bit more successful because we have this reinforcing. We already are establishing his credibility as a scientist, and now we're just putting that even further. So I'm going to go with D for 33. If you chose A for 33, you're pretty close. But really just try to evaluate what are the differences between these answer choices. Introduce versus reinforce is a really big clue. So for 34, we have a very simple detail question. According to the passage, which of the following conversions is a direct result of adding oxygen to molten pig iron? So according to the passage is what shows us, okay, I'm just going to be looking directly in the passage to get the answer. So what is the result of adding oxygen to pig iron? So we created a mental roadmap for ourselves that sort of structured it. So the Bessemer method, oxygen is pushing out impurities. Okay, so we already see that oxygen is pushing out impurities. We're going to look at this paragraph to see if there's anything special about what it does. It offered a way of removing impurities from pig iron and adjusting its carbon content. A blast of air through the molten metal turned impurities such as silicon into a light silica slag, which was something that could be removed from metal in the smelting process. And that in turn removed carbon in the form of volatile carbon dioxide. Okay, so we get rid of carbon dioxide, or we get rid of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, and we get rid of impurities in the form of silica slag. So we're getting rid of impurities. Let's see if anything says that. So A or F, light silica slag is converted into carbon dioxide. That doesn't make sense. That's the silica slag is a result. So conversion is weird there. G, carbon dioxide is converted into carbon. Okay, if you missed this one, you maybe chose G because G is a direct opposite of what actually happened and could be easily confused. So carbon is turned into carbon dioxide by adding oxygen, not the other way around. So we can get rid of G. H, silicon is converted into light silica slag. Okay, so yeah, it says that this happens. Detailed questions are just things which simply happen, right? An impurity like silicon is, with a blast of air, turned into a removable silica slag. J, impurities in the metal are converted into silicon. Okay, so this is not the conversion that takes place. Silicon is one of those impurities that is converted into something else. So that is why H is the only answer choice that makes sense for this detailed question. If you missed this, you probably fell for one of these distractors. You maybe were moving a little too quickly, which the ACT encourages us to do. But just really make sure that we're staying methodical with our approach in order to determine the differences between all these different answer choices. Because the difference between these answer choices is very particular, but it isn't always super evident just because silicon versus silica slag, carbon dioxide versus carbon. These things can be a little bit easy to confuse, so just make sure you're being methodical with what you're getting rid of. So 35, we have a rhetoric question that also serves as something of a vocab. In the context of the passage, very important wording there, in the context of the passage. That means we can't just look at what this word is saying and concern and think, what could the word spice mean? So in the context of the passage, the main effect of the word spice, line 37, is to emphasize something. So let's just take a look. So it was long known that steel can be improved with a spice of other elements. A dash of manganese removes oxygen and sulfur. Okay, so we're now seeing a bunch of different elements that can be added. Manganese also makes steel stronger, while nickel and chromium improve its hardness. Chromium is the key additive to stainless steel. It makes metal rust resistant. Most modern steels are therefore alloys. So the spice of other elements is the addition of elements which turn steel into an alloy which is more desirable. Maybe it is stronger, maybe it has more hardness, maybe it is stainless or rust resistant. So okay, so A, elements must be gradually mixed into steel in order to produce the desired result. Okay, this is a really good distractor. If you missed 35, there's a high chance that you chose A. Is there anything that suggests that it must be gradually mixed into steel? Is there anything which mentions the process by which these elements are added? No, right? So gradually is one of those tiny, tiny words that really, really clarifies why A would be right or wrong. Akin to the idea of saying, you're really smart for a student athlete. If we miss that little last part, we don't realize that someone's being insulting, right? So if we miss that gradually, then this is not as clear. So I think must is also a little bit too extreme, but gradually is the big problem with that. B, adding certain elements to steel can enrich the steel's quality. Okay, enrich and can, that feels a lot better. That doesn't feel so extreme or absolute. Remember, absolutism in our answer choices a lot of times is indicative of our possibly a too extreme distractor. That kind of absolute language is something we want to be aware of. It doesn't mean it's always wrong, but we just want to be aware of it like we were with A. So B just seems correct. C, these manganese, chromium, and nickel are used sparingly because of their expense. That isn't talked about at all, and spice doesn't connect to that. And then D, blending elements in a trial and error process has not yielded positive results. Okay, so this talks about the trial and error, and it actually is effective, so we can get rid of D, and it just is not in the right paragraph. So B is what makes sense for 35. Okay, so 36 is a pretty interesting question. So we have this based on the passage line, which typically is indicative of a detailed question, something which is very simply stated in the passage that we just need to go and find basically a couple lines of evidence and use that to answer our question. However, we quickly see when we look at the rest of the question and we look at our answer choices, this is a main idea question. So based on the passage, with which of the following statements would the author most likely agree? So now we really need to make sense of what is the structure, what is the main idea of this in order to determine what the author would believe. So F, metallurgy is not an art because it requires too much scientific knowledge. So the author seems to positively invoke the quote of, Rodney Cotterill, who says that metallurgy is one of our most ancient arts, but it is often referred to as one of the youngest sciences. So including this idea of art and science together seems to be what our author is more inclined to agree with. If you are not understanding how quickly we were able to move here, I'd suggest you watch the passage overview. So we can get rid of F because there is a suggestion that metallurgy is an art. They also mention that it has a certain air of an artisan craft, but there's also empiricism. Okay, G, metallurgy is too difficult to be considered a science. Okay, that's pretty ridiculous, so we can get rid of G. H, metallurgy is a science as well as an art. This really seems like the idea that is central to this passage. We have all this notion of demonstrating that people like Bessemer, Bergman, these initial kind of innovators within material sciences and metallurgy are, relevant. They're scientists. We need to see these innovators in metallurgy as scientists. But at the same time, we're saying that there's a sort of artisanship. There is an artistry according to physicists who worked in this field. So H looks really good. J, metallurgy is a trivial science. That is not the case. That is not suggested by the author anywhere. So H is what appeals to us. The reason why we can get rid of metallurgy as a trivial science, nowhere is the author suggesting this. If you chose something like J, maybe you fell for your own beliefs about metallurgy. Maybe you use a little bit too much of your background information. And then the other ones are kind of opposite distractors. So that is why H, main idea question in the form of a detailed question. So 37 is an interesting question. The passage most strongly suggests that the study of the behavior of materials and the study of social scientists are similar because. So in our passage overview, we identified how social science is invoked up here to kind of talk about the problem of scale, right? Talk about the fact that scale is difficult in materials, in studying materials, as well as social science. In social science, we have to figure out how individuals interact, but also how humans interact on a familial scale, a neighborhood scale, a city and societal and national level as well. All of these scales make understanding what people do more and more difficult. So too is the case with materials. We need to look at things on the range of individual atoms all the way to the shape of grains of micrometers and even millimeters in size. So looking across this full scale is really difficult. So let's see if anything aligns with scale. So A, requires analyses that span a wide range of scales. That is exactly what we're saying. So that aligns with what we already want to do. A looks really good. Let's just make sure nothing else is better. B, based on trial and error experimentation. That is not, so they talk a little bit about trial and error in materials earlier. If you chose this, you probably were just not looking in the right area. This is asking about the behavior of materials and the study of social sciences, not just the behavior of materials. So trial and error experimentation is a part of materials. They mention over the course of time that's become something that has revealed a lot of metallurgy's insights, but we don't use that to make sense of social sciences whatsoever either. C, involve examination of the size and shape of individual atoms. So the behavior of materials, studying materials requires this. But does it say that for social sciences? No. It's individuals, right? It's this atoms that makes this wrong. So, and then the size and shape. So that's what makes C wrong. And then D, produce results that must be interpreted by both scientists and artists. Not the case, it's not brought up whatsoever. So A is our only answer choice that seems sensible for 37. So 38 is another main idea question. The main idea of the last paragraph is that. So we're obviously going to be focused primarily on the final paragraph. We're going to need to probably at least consider the context of the passage as a whole. So these two things are going to combine to make sense of this last paragraph. So looking at it, I wrote, so in the overview, identified PS as problem solving. So problem solving with the fact that if there are flaws in that flaws in the crystal structure called defects are what create some of the imperfections in metals and materials. So there's some common flaws and discussed throughout, flaws such as dislocation and the fact that these dislocations can accumulate and make metal brittle. But it is, if we can reduce the size of the grains, it will mitigate to some degree the problems caused by dislocations, which are a result of flaws in the crystal structure. So how all these flaws interact with one another is what determines the efficacy of a metal. So all of these things are technical terms. Remember how important it is on science passages to identify technical terms which we may not know coming into the passage, because every passage's technical terms will be described and defined within the passage. So if you come into this wondering, what is a crystal structure? What are flaws in the crystal structure? These things are defects, right? It's clarified for us. And these defects can compile upon each other to create dislocations. So 38, main idea is, so F, defects in the crystal structure of a metal determine the metal's mechanical properties. That sounds really good, right? So how strong or how brittle a metal is can be determined by the crystal structure's defects. G, dislocations are the most common type of stacking fault in a metal. Okay, so I think that that's true according to this passage, to this paragraph, right? So the most common type of stacking fault is called dislocation. That's correct, it's true. So we can't get rid of G just quite yet, but I wonder if that's the main idea. That seems to be more of a detail or a piece of evidence that supports the main idea, which is that defects are created in the crystal structure, and there are certain things we can do to try to mitigate these defects. H, the mechanical behavior of a metal can be modified by increasing the size of metal's grains. Okay, that's also a fact, right? So making a metal's grains smaller can modify their mechanical behavior. I wonder if that's the main idea, though. J, microscopic grains divide a metal into mosaics of crystallites. That is not a main idea. So looking between F, G, and H, we really have to be thinking, what is the main idea? What is this paragraph serving for us? Which is to say, everything about defects. G and H, while both present in the paragraph, don't define why the paragraph is there. The paragraph is to serve to show why the crystal structure that's invoked in the scale paragraph is so important and how it can be problem solved. So if we do not understand that crystal defects in the crystal structure determine the mechanical properties, how could we even get to G or H? That's why F is the actual answer, it defines the main idea, even though F, G, and H are all present. A tough question, absolutely. But really have to think about what is the point of this? What is it serving? Think about from the author's perspective. Okay, so 39, a simple word of context question. So as used in line 56, the word stretched, what nearly means. So let's find this. According to Rodney Control, a remarkable British physicist whose experience stretched from sciences of material to that of the brain. Okay, so his experience stretched from material science to science of the brain. It seems to express that there's a wide breadth of experience that he has. So I think we could say something along the lines of spanned. His experience spanned the science of metals to that of the brain. If we find anything that seems related to that, we're going to be good. So remember, fit and definition is going to be helpful. So strained. Strained suggests some sort of effort, difficulty, and while it may be hard to do this, that breadth is not this that doesn't align whatsoever. B, exaggerated. You can get rid of that as well. C, extended. That seems pretty close to span. D, amplified. That would suggest that his experience amplified the science of materials in the brain. Doesn't really make sense as well. So pretty simple word in context. One of the more simple word in context I've seen. I think what maybe would have made this question difficult if you got this wrong is that perhaps you found stretched elsewhere. Perhaps you, in this whole discussion of materials, metal, that metal can stretch came up and you thought, maybe metal stretching is straining. You didn't look at line 56. But if you're really taking a look and seeing how does this function, what is the point of this sentence, putting that sentence into the context of the passage, extended as a form of span should be pretty obvious. So our final question here, 40, is a very simple detail question. So according to the passage, which 95% of the time is saying this is going to be directly in there, it's going to be a detail question. So according to the passage, reducing the size of a metal's grains can make the metal, one of these things. So where do we talk about reducing the grains of metal? So in our passage overview, we identified this problem-solving paragraph, and we see in this last sentence, the arrest of dislocations at grain edges means that metals may be made harder by reducing the size of their grains, a useful trick for modifying their mechanical behavior. So metals may be made harder by reducing grains. So let's see if anything aligns with this idea that a metal can become harder by reducing grains. And we see it with J. So simple detail question. We just have to identify what was actually in the passage, have that proof. More rust resistant, that was solved with chromium. More brittle was a problem created by too much carbon. And finer is something that wasn't really referred to anywhere. So harder is our good one. H, if you chose finer, you may have just thought, better, right? That might have been the distractor, but we want to see almost word for word. In this case, it is word for word. Detailed questions require that kind of specificity. And that's that with our ACT 198.